You could see the 60s as the last sputter of the pure American flame. That is to say, we rule the world. Japan was a joke. You know, Japanese cars, I remember when the first Toyota came out. I mean, it was like a sport. And Volkswagen, in the early 60s, had to kind of advertise itself in this hip way, you know. I mean, it had to say, it'd be really weird and have this car. You know, it was like saying, I'm weird, I drive a Volkswagen, you know. And it was a kind of like an egghead, you know, a symbol of a certain kind of eccentricity. They had to play it up that way. It isn't something any mainstream person would want. Who'd want a little car like that, putt, 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 when you can have a, you know, Cadillac, big fins. It was the last gasp of America isolated from the world economy, feeling no threats. And, you know, the boom years. And, you know, spending billions to protect Germany, billions to protect Japan, billions to protect Vietnam. We had it all. We could do it all. And we weren't going to be threatened. It was the last. I mean, what was that 1974 recession about, after all? It was about OPEC, some guys with sheets on them, you know, stopping the world economy. Who the hell were they? We couldn't even pronounce where the Abu Dhabi. What is that? I mean, you know, suddenly the third world was standing up and saying, we're here too. And and Americans were recognizing that some of the old feeling against the colonial powers, we were never a colonial power, of course, tell it to the Philippines, tell it to Latin America, but we were never a colonial power. Some of that was coming against us. And these guys in the sheets were, you know, were now calling, you know, doubling the price of oil overnight. And that was announcing the end of it, that we just weren't the top dogs economically anymore. And, you know, when you think of the 60s, you think of this kind of super grow, you know, big this and multiversity that and mega this and big blast furnaces and so on. Meanwhile, the Japanese were building small, you know, they were fiddling around with little things. And these little things, it turned out, were bigger than any of the big things of the 60s. So it was the last fling of the isolated American economy. And it had a kind of Dionysiac excess to it, I think, because people must have sensed that it couldn't go on. You know, rates of growth of 4 and 5%, unemployment of 3%, you know, good times, good times.
And what about the, was there something having the same Dionysian kind of obsession with fun and with being with it and with self-fulfillment? Did that permanently diminish our ability to compete? Is that one of the legacies of the 60s?
I see what you mean. It was that countercultural legacy kind of, you know, we looked inward and started looking at our navel when we should have been working overtime. It may have. I mean, the Japanese don't seem to have had a 60s yet. A friend of mine who was over there said they're sort of in their late 50s. It's coming. But they haven't had their 60s. And, you know, the old male authority is firmly in place, if anxiously in place. And the consumer ethic, they suppress their consumers in the interest of their producers. And their teenagers live in a kind of awful world of, you know, repression and exam taking and so on. So they seem to have tried to immunize themselves against what Walter Lippmann, speaking of the culture of the 20s, called the acids of modernity. And those acids of modernity were loosed in the 60s, there's no question about it. And they made us softer and gentler and more less hardworking. They made happiness seem more important than productivity. They made people think about, you know, I mean, my father never gave a thought to whether he was happy. The whole issue was, you know, am I doing right by my family? And I wake up in the night and I think, God, is this really what it's all about? I mean, he never questioned whether it was all about. It was just what he had to do, what a man did. And all this talk about, you know, the self and its unrealized potential and so on. This was a closed book in the 50s. and all of that got opened up. And yes, it may have softened us and lamed us. And one has the picture of the sort of veteran of the '60s going to the commune in Vermont and living the quiet, contemplative life instead of working for IBM. It may have done that, but on the other hand, I think it gave people a vocabulary of feeling and a vocabulary of freedom they didn't have before, so that expressively at least, and we live our lives expressively after all, people could connect, and they had a language of connection which they didn't have before.